Hello and welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, a show hosted by the Permaculture Education Institute. I'm Morag Gamble. Join me each week in conversation with leading ecological thinkers, activists, authors, designers and practitioners to explore what now? What is the kind of thinking we need to navigate a positive and regenerative way forward, to myceliate possibilities, to explore what a thriving one planet way of life could look like. My guests offer voices of clarity and common sense. In this episode, I'm speaking with the wonderful Poppy Okotcha, a qualified permaculture designer based in Devon, an ecological home grower, forager and home cook, passionate about ecological, local community food systems and forest gardening. She's part of the Grow Share Collective and tends also a 5 by 30 metre edible and medicinal forest garden next to her home. She loves creating, tending and learning from edible and medicinal spaces that are sustainable, nourishing, beautiful and useful and wild. Poppy is a sought-after speaker at events and festivals, and she writes widely about these issues. She's been featured on BBC Gardener's World and co-hosted The Great Garden Revolution on Channel 4. Coming from a modelling background, a rising star in the London fashion scene, on the catwalk with Vivienne Westwood and other designers, she has presence and popularity that I'm so delighted that she's bringing now to the world of permaculture. It was just so great to speak with Poppy. She loves permaculture thinking, designing and plants as much as me. To find out more about Poppy's social media, writings and all of her work, check out the show notes below. This Sense Making in the Changing World podcast, as I said, is an initiative of the Permaculture Education Institute. We teach permaculture design, teaching and business skills to people on 6 continents, who in turn localise and enrich it and find appropriate ways to apply the planet care ethics of earth care, people care and fair share wherever they are. I'm recording this episode from my hand-built solar-powered studio here on beautiful Gubbi Gubbi country, surrounded by my permaculture design gardens in a permaculture eco-village. Before we jump in, I'd love to invite you to subscribe to Sense Making the Changing World on your favourite podcast app. And please do leave us a 5-star review and a lovely comment, because it does actually help the bots to find this podcast. All right, I hope you enjoy this conversation just as much as I did. Oh, thank you so much, Poppy, for joining me on the show today. It's an absolute delight to have you here, sharing about your love of plants, your love of gardening, and how you've landed with ecological gardening as your way of showing up in the world, of speaking up for what you feel really matters. And so maybe just like, let's start with a really big question of like, what is it that really motivates you to want to step up and speak up? What are the things that you find just dwell, that are in your heart that you feel you can use this as a platform to speak about?
Oh, that's a really lovely question. Thank you so much for having me here. It's like a pleasure to chat about this. So what motivates me? Well, I suppose like I grew up in South Africa in my childhood years, and it was South Africa just freshly post-apartheid, so I saw a lot of like the impact of a very unjust society, and I suppose like as a young adult and as a kid, that like really drove me, and I think that from that kind of like initial experience in childhood, it's like given me quite a keen sense of like, if there's something wrong, you've got to do something about it, because people suffer like in real terms. So I think that's definitely like a big driving factor for me. And then there was also an element of like, as I was kind of coming towards what I do now, I was working in fashion and had like a very real personal experience of like understanding the detrimental impacts of working in an industry that's so extractive, and that I suffered personally, emotionally and physically from that industry. So I suppose there's also like a personal element to it, that I saw like how incredibly healing engaging with food and food growing can be, like in a really holistic sense. And I was just like, whoa, this is like incredible. I can't like keep this to myself. So I think, those are the two things that really feed me. And I'm just so inspired by like the garden, the land, living world. Like it just like it feels infectious, and it feels like how dare I if I don't like share this.
I know, it's just, and every day there's something so beautifully fascinating when you just walk out and connect in that way. Yeah, I
Yeah.
totally
Feels like
get it. Yeah.
such a powerful antidote to a lot of the issues that we face in our modern society, and not only powerful but beautiful and enjoyable. And I think that yeah, for me is just like so incredibly exciting.
Yeah, like you're saying, at a really deeply personal level, but also as a way to speak up about whether it be social injustices, about mental health, about the climate crisis, about the loss of biodiversity. I mean, all of these things we can address by really grounding ourselves where we are and rewilding those spaces and feeding ourselves from those spaces and connecting with our communities. I mean, it's incredibly powerful. I wonder how it came to you, though, that gardening is that thing, because you were in modeling and now you're in the garden. And what
Yeah,
in between there?
yeah, I was just like nodding along so ferociously to that, what you were just saying about the power that it dwells in our gardens or in the land. And I suppose I like witnessed that fairly early on. So I went to Steiner School. And at that school, they taught us about composting, and they'd take us to like farms, and we just got like a very basic understanding of like how things grow and die and cycle. And that, I guess, was like a foundation that I could then return to when I was older. And then also when we returned from South Africa, my mum was suffering with like mental health issues. And one of the things that just like really transformed her was starting gardens. There wasn't like any money and we were moving around a lot. But every time we were going to like a new home, she'd start a garden, and it was like really special for our family, really important for her. And so I think that also taught me like, yeah, it was like a play. I had early memories of the garden being a place that was like really healing and enjoyable and positive. And I guess I'd seen what had happened to my mum. And so I suppose like, even though I didn't have words for it, I had zero understanding of like the positive impact of being outdoors. I suppose I had like a direct experience of it. So then and also then when we came back from South Africa, we were living in the countryside, and like my mum is very like planty, and she'd take us like foraging and things. I mean, she wouldn't call it foraging, we just, because that wasn't like a word that we used. It was just like, we'll just go and find something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a lot of that, and I suppose that meant that I had like a foundational kind of place to return to. And when I was kind of like in my period of like really searching, there was that to return to. And as well as the fact that because I was trying to heal myself through food, I was like then curious about where the food came from, and at the same time was understanding more about climate change and the impacts of that. And in a weird way, the thing of like me being curious about healing myself and being curious about how I can help heal the global issues we're facing kind of lined up, and the same thing could do both. And I suppose, yeah, that's how I ended up here. There was already a foundation of it, and then the dots started connecting, which took me back there, I suppose.
Yeah, it's so powerful when that moment of realization happens, isn't it? That I have agency to be part of the global movement of change by paying attention to healing what's right in front of me and what's within me. And I think that's huge. That's a huge thing. And I love too that you're saying about your mum, and how that just was infused in you, that experience of it without the language of it. And it makes me realize too how important it is that we have opportunities for young people to cultivate a love for plants, for growing. And actually, just on the mental health issue, I was having a chat with another woman today, who's doing a PhD in social work and mental health. And she's saying she's actually starting a project now to look at how to prescribe permaculture as a way of healing through the mental health professions. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting. Just such a shift, I think, in how they're thinking about addressing the growing mental health issues that I know here in Australia anyway, and possibly around the world. But coming back to the garden, though, how did you learn this? I mean, you had a sense of having experiencing the garden through your mum, but not knowing the language of it or maybe how it all works. So where did you learn to actually find out about how to do this, or did you just find your own way?
I did a lot of self-teaching because I was excited and passionate. There was a lot of YouTube and books. And I did also some short courses. There was a moment that my partner and I were in India, and God, when was that? Maybe like it might have been like 2016 maybe. And we were in Oroville, and we met this amazing guy whose name I can't remember right now, who basically he was a British guy. I think he was northern. He'd moved to India like many years ago, and he spoke the local dialect, and you couldn't tell he was British from his accent because it sounded to me anyway like he sounded like local. But he was a white guy, and he was basically like cultivating this incredible permaculture food forest, and through that cultivation he was feeding a lot of the community at Oroville, and also there was a lot of like really dignified, meaningful jobs being provided for the local community who weren't part of the Oroville, by the way, is like an experimental kind of utopian community experiment situation happening in India. And that was the first time I saw like a really amazing food forest, and I was like, whoa, this is doing like so much. He was like putting his hands in the soil and like pulling out bits and like smelling. It's the first time I'd seen someone like really involved with their landscape. And so he was probably the guy that inspired me to be like, oh, he was talking about soil life, and I was like, whoa, I didn't even know that you could talk about soil.
No, that's right.
Yeah. So yeah, he was probably the guy that sparked like a thing of like, oh, I want to know what he knows. Like he's got the good stuff. And then that got me really into permaculture. I was looking at a lot of different permaculture practitioners and what qualifications they had done in the past. And so I did one of the qualifications that kept coming up, which was with the Royal Horticulture Society in the UK. And that was a year-long training in like the basics basically of like plant science. It was less practical and more like kind of the sort of stuff you learn in school about what actually is going on inside a plant, what is actually going on under the ground. And that was a really good foundation for, personally, I enjoyed that. And then various courses, and did some time also at a like a little kitchen garden in the south of Spain, and then eventually and also some community gardens in London, and then eventually I'm here, my garden here in Devon, and running a community market garden just outside of town as well.
Wow. So your garden, I've seen some pictures of your garden. It looks absolutely stunning, and I've seen pictures of you drawing it, so doing your permaculture design, or I'm not sure if it's entirely permaculture or how you describe it, but maybe you could tell us a bit about that. But it's long and it's thin. So tell us about your garden. I mean, it sounds phenomenal and looks phenomenal.
Yeah, so it's like 6.5 max wide meters, that is. So it's not super, it's kind of like a long thin corridor, and it's about 30 meters long. It's on a site, so I live in like a really old town. And I actually went to like the archives of the local area, and the old ladies who look after them, they were explaining to me that this, like the boundary wall on one side of the garden, has probably been here since pre-1700s. They think like a lot earlier than that. And this site used to be a plot that was used by the people, like the local tradesmen. They had each like a burgage plot behind their properties, where they'd like basically subsist. Like they had a pig and like a bread oven, and grew veggies and had fruit bushes and trees and stuff, like a cottage garden. So this garden is currently a third of that original burgage plot. So it's like that plot that was previously used for like a genuine family to subsist on has been divided into three. And yeah, it's I love it so much. It's like, so at the very end there's apple trees, so I guess that's like the zone that's furthest away. And then there's like an annual veg area, and then there's greenhouse, and then there's like a more perennial herbal area, and that's the kind of layout. And then there's like a long narrow path that weaves through all of that. And when I arrived here, there was already quite a lot of fairly established perennials, which were really lovely, like a really great big myrtle bush. There's the apple trees. One of them is like really, really old. Various herbs as well, including annual and biannual herbs, which kind of like pop up, you know, here and there, which is really, really nice. It creates like a lot of dynamism in the garden. Things like evening primrose and fennel, and loads of poppies and marjoram as well, wild marjoram. And so basically when I came to the space, I really wanted to maintain the incredible wildness of the space, and it was full of insects, full of birds. It was really like special. So a lot of the design has been about, okay, what's already here? I mean, as all permaculture design is, but there was a lot there already. So it was like, okay, how do I slot myself in to this like incredibly abundant space that already exists? So for example, there was several like an area where the veg beds are now, which was covered in bin bags full of garden waste that had been left there for I don't know how long, which lucky for me, in the bin bags, because the garden waste had been there for so long, it decomposed and created amazing compost. And below the bin bags, it was like mulched, right? Because like the light had been excluded. So that's the area that became the annual veg beds, because they'd kind of been accidentally prepared for me. And that compost in those bags became the first layer of, you know, no dig compost that went on top of them. Yeah. And then I don't know, what's another thing about the design? So initially, I really wanted to have the veg area near to the house because it's an area that I'm obviously using a lot. But then ultimately decided that because the garden's so long and thin, it's probably a good idea to have the annual veg a little bit further away to like kind of draw me through the space.
Nice.
And the same with the compost as well, because otherwise there's the risk of the garden becoming like only used in this like very small area close to the house, because there's just one long path. There's no like winding around the place. Yeah. So some of the first
things, because it kind of flips what, you know, like what normally is said in permaculture, bring it close to home. But that idea of actually wanting to draw yourself out into the space. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, with my garden here, I don't. So when I come into the place, you actually have to walk through the garden to get to the house. And I had mine was just a blank site, so I had the chance to actually design that. And I wanted to do that because as I was coming home, I could talk to the chickens, get some veggies, go down to the house, bring the eggs down and cook up some dinner. As I'm heading out again, can pick up some like odd leaves and toss them to the chickens and say goodbye and, you know, check it. And so it's like that embeddedness. And I think making sure we design ourselves into the space. And I think that's so beautiful. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's one of the things that drew me to permaculture was the idea of like, you know, traditionally a garden is separate in a way. I really loved the importance of like, you know, you are part of that ecosystem and like design yourself and your needs into it as well. That's something that I found really exciting in permaculture.
Yeah. And you did a fair bit of study, I heard, with Martin Crawford and people like that with on the food forest programs.
Yeah, I did a course with him, and that was another really inspiring experience, I suppose, because I'd seen the food forest out in India, and that was like the most incredible thing ever. And then I saw like a few smaller scale ones in the UK, and they didn't quite have the like impact that the other one had had. I mean, it's hard to cultivate something like that in our climate. So then when I went and did see what Martin's doing, that was like mind blowing. I was like, hey, yeah, this is another person who like knows something. And yeah, I think his book is probably like one of my most like bedraggled looking books.
It's so which one? I mean, he's got lots of books. Great. Yeah.
Which one? I think it's just called the Forest Garden, isn't
Yeah,
it?
okay. Yeah, he's got a few, and a few that are also about cooking and different types of plants and things. But yeah,
The one that's just like literally how to grow a forest garden, and it's got
okay.
like a huge index of plants and like what their
Yeah,
uses are. And
yeah, yeah. So
I'll
you've got,
find the title and let you know for the
yeah,
notes.
great. And we can pop it down in the link below as well. I actually remember, I think I told you I remember that site because I spent a lot of time in and around where the Agroforestry Research Trust is. And I remember that as a paddock. And then I went back there 20 years later and, well, 10 years later, then 20 years later, and have seen that transformation. It's extraordinary. And what it makes me think is how quickly, really, like 20 years is a long time, but it's not really.
No, yeah, yeah.
You can transform from an empty paddock to a beautiful, multifaceted forest that is home to so many species. And it's this kind of concept of regeneration and telling the story of what's possible is really important. And I, I wonder, what are the kinds of things that you find what stories do you find yourself going out and telling? Because I know you're a speaker and a writer. What kind of stories of inspiration do you find yourself going out and sharing to myceliate this kind of passion and interest?
That's a really nice question. I think that the story that I find most exciting at the moment is that kind of what I was saying a second ago, that we are nature, that we are part of it. Because I think that for me that was like a really big thing to feel. And I think that is like ultimately when we go around with a genuine like experience of that, not just like a heady understanding, but like a feeling of it. I think it really changes how we interact with one another and the world around us. And I'm a big believer that although the climate crisis and so many of the various social justice issues that we face today require like complex legislation and a lot of like fine detail in various industries, that at the end of the day, if the uniting kind of story that we as a community, as a culture tell ourselves is rooted in that understanding of connectivity and relationality, then the detail can be filled in by the people who have access to that kind of information. And yeah, I mean, like I was actually having an interesting conversation with my partner this morning, and he was saying, I don't think there's going to be any change unless there's legislation. And then I was saying, like, kind of the same, but like legislation won't come unless there's a public mandate, and the public mandate won't come unless we as a people decide that we have a different system of priorities or a different value system. So that's the thing that for me I find like most powerful on an individual level, because it feels like the level of awe and wonder which is so important for us to experience as humans, and like the comfort in being part of something as an individual is powerful, but then for the collective has like so much capacity to hugely and radically change the way that we structure our culture and do our business. So that's the thing that I find exciting. And I think that's probably the reason that I harp on about gardening at all, because I think that like if there wasn't that radical element to it, I wouldn't be excited about it. Because for me, coming to gardening was like, how do I do something good? And that it gave that.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I'm doing them nodding and nodding. Yeah, absolutely. I have this way of explaining like the radical nature of it and the power of it. That the power is not always in the government change, and often you might get a change and then the policy changes, and the power is with us in our communities, myceliating. This is kind of with this understanding of how soil works and soil life works, and every now and then there'll be there's all the projects. You scratch any community and you'll find this kind of stuff, and then they're all connected. And every now and then you'll see these little mushrooms pop up, which is a project, a community garden, or someone speaking up about it. And then if we keep composting, like there'll be new mushrooms that come up, and that's this. It's all connected. We're all talking to each other in different ways and co-creating this without a plan. It's this distributive model of actually lifting up a different way forward. So that's kind of how I think about power and change, and it is about bringing together people as well. And And I understand that you share a love of community gardens and community food projects as well. Can you tell us a bit about the community food project you're involved with?
Yeah. So the project, so it's on a piece of land which is owned by a local estate. About 10 years ago, it was secured by a group of young people who were basically trying to find affordable housing. And the original idea was that they'd be able to build homes on the land. Um, and that wasn't possible because of the usage of the site. You couldn't build homes there. And so it kind of evolved into a community space. That was 10 years ago. And it's had like sort of various things happening on that piece of land over the years. But something that's kind of stayed consistent is that there's a little portion of the, 4 acres in total, a little portion of it, which is a little market garden. And at different times, it's been more productive than others, depending on like the kind of momentum behind the people, because it's entirely community run. And then during the pandemic, there was like a real surge in interest from the local community and wanting to get interested in it, involved in it. That was before my time with them. And following that, they started a CSA, community supported agriculture veg box scheme, where they were basically utilizing this like momentum of volunteer people. And the idea was that they'd be able to produce a veg box with those volunteers. But as COVID, like the restrictions lifted, and producing a veg box for paying customers changes the dynamic of a market garden hugely. People kind of like, drifted away, and Sasha, the person that I like co-run with the place with, ended up being the last person standing. And then the following year after that, rather than doing a veg box again, they started a project called Grow Share. The idea being that rather than people paying for their veg box, people come and grow their own veg box. So I signed up to that, kind of thinking, it'll be so nice to just like do what I'm told and just like meet people and not be like one making decisions about a growing space. And then very quickly realized that that's not how the project runs. It's like very self-organizing, and it's not about a top-down kind of like instruction. And at first I was like, oh, damn, it's going to take energy. But then it actually was incredible, because Sasha was like, would you come and like co-run this with me? And that was last year, and now we're in our second year, and it is like such an incredible experience in like seeing how a project can emerge that is less top down. We still get stuff done. It's such an interesting experience. And people, I thought that the main sort of draw point would be that people get food that's ecologically produced, but it turns out the main draw point is the community element, which is really an incredible kind of emergent property.
Yeah it's amazing, isn't it? And I wonder too whether you have it set up as an educational space as well, or just as a meeting space.
So we meet weekly, and Sasha and we like plan the space and order the seed and and loosely plan what the learning sort of element for the session is going to be, depending on what's happening in the garden. A lot of the people who are on the scheme have zero growing experience, so a huge part of it is educational, but the idea being that it's learning through doing. So there'll be like a sort of run through practically and verbally, and then we do it. And
it seems to me like in the sort of the southwest of England, and particularly around Devon, there seems to be an enormous amount of local food action happening. Is there a lot of conversations happening between the groups? Like, do you feel it like there? Because in some places it can be quite dispersed, and you can kind of feel alone in your project. Other places it feels like, there's an aliveness in this, and support beyond, your little bubble. Is that?
Yeah, that's partly why we moved here, actually, because we were in London before, and it felt like a very good place to come and be new in this stuff. And like be wanting to still be learning, if that makes sense. And yes, there's a real sense of like there's people here who know, like, Martin Crawford, one of the ladies who's on the scheme, she works for him, so she's constantly coming back with like the most incredible information, and sometimes plants as well.
Yes,
So there's definitely like, wonderful connections between everyone. There's actually like a WhatsApp group chat where a lot of kind of like information sharing happens, and with all most of the local growers in the area.
Yeah, fantastic. And so when you write or speak out into the world, if you go and travel and speak or write into more mainstream magazines, what do you find is the message that lands most in most fertile soil?
That's really interesting.
Because it's that kind of question, isn't it? Like, permaculture has often been, I've been doing permaculture for 30 odd years, and it started as kind of a fringy thing, but it's moving into something people go, oh yeah, I get what this is about. And I wonder, that was the question. What parts of it do you feel where you are land and just resonate with people?
Mm-hmm. Well, I stopped calling what I do permaculture because I was finding that it was not necessarily reaching all of the people it needed to reach. I think as you say, that's probably changing now, and I don't know if it's such like a thing, but certainly, I found that the kind of more, let's say, conservative, maybe like less curious about this sort of stuff people maybe, and like publications maybe were far more keen for the diluted version of gardening, i.e. the more kind of like traditional, like retired person enjoying the flowers in their garden. And so it was about how do I attach the like more radical element to that in a way that feels like appealing for people who are maybe just like curious, or maybe not even curious yet, and I kind of want to make them curious.
So what do you call it? What do you call it?
Ecological gardening.
Yeah.
And it's funny because even that, people be like, but gardening is ecological. What are you talking about? You're growing plants. And and even that's interesting that there's like a kind of public misunderstanding of the fact that, horticulture in the UK is like, it's the same as fast fashion. Like it's an industry it's not rooted in circularity or any of those things. So a lot of the kind of like pieces that I write for publications, etc., publications that are more kind of mainstream, end up being people like, oh, can you just like talk about what you do in your garden? And, we just want our readers to have like a really lovely, immersive, joyful experience. And so that is usually the sort of the tool, I suppose, I use. And I will sort of describe for example, beautiful day in the garden, and then like sneak in stuff about circularity or soil life or growing organic, like basic things like that.
It's interesting, isn't it, as a way of, if you can, in whatever way we can, just be opening up some of those doors and gently ways and allow that curiosity to sort of dive a bit deeper. So in a lot of the work that you do, you are invited to speak on many different platforms and with some, amazing people that are extraordinary spokespeople themselves. And I wonder, what are those, apart from, about what goes on in the garden, what are those key radical messages that you talk about as a spokesperson in this space?
I suppose apart from the we are nature element, I suppose the thing that is normally coming up is, well, compost and food, like the fact that because we all eat, this is something that we can all engage with and tap into, and because we all eat, we're all producing a certain kind of waste, and that is another kind of access point into all of this. So I suppose that's the two conversations that come up a lot, is like engaging or encouraging a more food just system like isn't just about land restoration. There's like a really significant human justice element to it around access to good food that is good for our bodies, and access to green space that is good for our minds and good for our communities. So I think that's probably the the other main kind of like message that comes through. It's like that food justice, land justice and food justice isn't just about like biodiversity. Like we have to remember that we're part of that, and that's important too. And then I suppose, yeah, the composting bit is like that often comes up, which is, you know, exploring the idea of food waste. And, you know, like there's a crazy statistic that about like a third of all food grown like gets wasted in the end. I mean, that's not entirely from like you know, our food waste in our homes. A lot of that is also to do with like before it even reaches the supermarkets, etc. But there was huge food waste issue, and often when it is coming out of our homes, it's then ending up on landfill, which creates, you know, huge pollutant issues. And it's a really beautiful example of how something can be a problem or a solution, you know, as we talk about in permaculture, and that this, you know, food waste, which can become really pollutant and toxic on a landfill, can become like literally the stuff of life on a compost heap. And that's something that often comes up because it just demonstrates so beautifully the power of circularity, and the incredible resources we have at our fingertips that we think of as waste and to become waste, you know.
I think that whole kind of food waste concept is absolutely huge. And when you think about it, you know, the figure that you said is what we hear. I also kind of think, as a home gardener, you realize how much extra gets waste as well. Like, for example, a broccoli plant, like we only ever get the broccoli, you know, immature flower and all the rest of it. So if you actually think about the possibilities, the radical possibilities as home gardeners of diminishing the waste of food entirely, I think we could probably cut it by about 90%. I think if we start to think about eating all different parts of plants and foraging wild foods as well. And I wanted to ask you, what's your favorite forage plant in your part of the world?
Well, I was about to say blackberries because I was picking them this morning. Um, and there's just like such a fond memory of childhood. Like they, like, you know, we'd spend so much time picking blackberries. But I think maybe meadow sweet. I don't know if you have that where you
Oh,
are.
no, I don't.
Um, how is it? Filipendula ulmaria, I think is the Latin. And it yeah, it's a beautiful flower. She kind of like grows in damp, boggy meadows. I've never seen her growing in an urban space before, but maybe she could. And has these really incredible scented leaves and flowers, which smell kind of like almonds and vanilla and like, yeah, almondy vanilla. And is actually the one of the compounds in the plant was used ultimately to synthesize the thing that became aspirin, and aspirin was named after the previous Latin name of the plant, which is it's changed now. I can't remember what the previous Latin name was, but so it's a really powerful herb for like soothing inflammation and pain, and smells incredible. So I pick a lot of that over like the solstice and through into late summer. There's still some out now, and the leaves also in spring. I think, yeah, that's definitely a foraging plant that's one of my favorites.
How do you use it? How do you use it?
I just dry the leaves and flowers and drink as tea, like with nettles in the evening is like a really nice soothing tea. And I drink, like if I've got like a tense stomach or like tense head or headache even, or stomach pain even, I will drink that. And it apparently makes like the most delicious ice cream, but I've never tried. I've only ever had meadow sweet as a tea.
So how did you find out this information, this knowledge? Is it through speaking to people? It's just researching in books? Like, have you got? Yeah.
I suppose, you know, when you're just like obsessed with something, you just like absorb it. Like, you'll like overhear a conversation and you'll like take note.
Yeah.
Stuff like
That's
that.
what I love about community gardening. You can be out and about with a group of people in the garden, and you'd be doing something beside, and then all these stories about someone's grandmother used to do this, or someone's auntie did that, and often the women folk of the family, yeah, and the stories that get shared. And I think some of those that richness of the texture of the stories and the information that comes through that is just extraordinary. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely through people. And then also, I suppose, yeah, the internet and a lot of books. Like, there's a book called Herbarium, which is really great. Another one called Medicine of the Hedgerow. Those two are like two of my favorite herb books. But yeah, I buy a lot of books, and in charity shops where you can find books that are like really old and sometimes have like pretty cool information that is not like held in the same regard that it used to be. I think that is really valuable, finding really old gardening or foraging books.
Yeah. And when you just mentioned then hedgerows too, that's something we don't have here in Australia. And I've always been in awe of as I walk through the English landscape, just seeing the diversity in that and the life that's in them, and how they were just kind of invisible for a while and just cleared. And I understand there's quite a resurgence of them in places. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. There's such like a better understanding of, yeah, as you say, the diversity they hold. I find hedgerows particularly fascinating because the kind of like mentality that can come with rewilding, the idea of like divorce humans from the landscape because we're bad for it. I love hedgerows as like a tool of demonstrating just how incredible we can be for a landscape, because a hedgerow is human maintained space, and our interaction makes it incredible. Like we historically have got food, fiber, forage, medicine, like fuel from them, and probably so much more. And by cultivating them ecologically, they also then become home for birds and so much forage for wildlife protection, like all of these things. I think hedgerows are a really exciting sort of example. I guess kind of like compost. They become like there's certain things in growing that can kind of become symbols.
Yeah.
Which I really like.
Yeah. I'm searching for a word at the moment. I don't know if you can help me out, because as you were talking, then it's that sense of we are embedded in the natural world and surrounded by food, whether it be the wild food or the food that we're tending to and all of that. And I'm looking for the word that's that feeling of that feeling held and feeling safe and secure and nurtured by being in this landscape that we're deeply in relationship with. I know there's a word biophilia, but that's sort of more about connecting with nature. But that sense of being surrounded by our medicines and our foods and the forage and all of those, there's got to be a word in a language somewhere. I can imagine maybe, or maybe not.
I think for me, I know, I bet there's a word in
There has to be a word, doesn't
a
there?
non-English language, but for me the word would be belonging,
Mm.
because yeah, it's like we're part of it and our needs are met, and we can have these exchanges with the landscape, and for me that's belonging, really.
And so I mean, I feel like you have a sense of relationship to your garden like I do to mine. When you're standing in the middle of it and you just feel it around you, like, how does it make you feel? Like, what does your garden mean to you at a deep level?
I love that. Sometimes I feel very small, even though my garden's tiny. Sometimes I'll be like looking at all of the like relationships unfolding in front of my eyes and just feel so small in a really nice way. Because there's like, because my garden is not massive and yet it's still full of like all this complexity, I'm just like, oh my God, my mind is blown all the time by the garden. Sometimes I feel hugely frustrated because there's always something that can be done, and things are alive, so they do whatever they want to do, not always what you want them to do, and that's like a constant like learning experience. And sometimes I feel like I suppose torn, because I never seem to have enough time in the garden ever. It doesn't matter how much time I'm there. Peaceful, energized, like so many feelings. I guess that's why I like gardens, because they are alive. It's like a dynamic relationship. It's not just like, I'm looking at a candle right now. It's not just like, oh, a smelly candle, which always smells nice. It's like, it's like sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad and sometimes it's ugly and sometimes it's beautiful, and that's like the beauty of it.
Yeah, and sometimes it's squidgy underfoot, like it might be now with
Yeah.
all the rain you said you get.
And sometimes it's parched dry and you're like, no.
Yeah, that's right. I often think about myself now, because I've been here in this garden for about 20 odd years now. I kind of feel like I'm the gardening, not the gardener. And that's, it's beautiful. It just feels so great. And I have a sense that that's kind of what you're getting there as well. I wonder what.
Can I just say, I love that you are the gardening. That gave me chills. I think that's so beautiful. You are the gardening. Yeah.
Yeah.
One day to have been in a space for 20 years, I can't wait for that experience.
Yeah. It goes like that. I'll tell you now. And it's, as you were speaking about, the joy and the peace and the frustration and all those things I feel too, all the things, all the time that I don't get to spend, but I would love to spend. And that's why my little studio that I built here is wrapped around by the garden. So the chickens are just out there, the food forest is here, and the compost is just within sight. And I can kind of see everything. I can look across to the forest, past the lake, and yeah. So even if I do need to be in here, I still have everything just around, which is super nice. Yeah.
Do you grow annual veggies and things as well?
Well, I mostly encourage ones that love to self-seed. And so I have this section right down near my house that surrounded the house, which is just, full of annuals and perennials that, the salads and the leafy greens and the beans and the peas and all that kind of stuff as well, just in that patch. And sometimes I create like a forage garden. And then when something sort of dies back, I'll just, like little mosaic plantings rather than having beds. And that's sort of how it works.
So you have like a kind of area of annual vegetables, but it's more like, it's not like rows. You're kind of growing in a more of a modest kind of polyculture sort of style.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I respond, like if something comes up, then it's like, oh, great. And then I'll sort of adapt to that. And then something might fall over and then I'll adapt to that rather than making the plan of how it all works. And and I kind of, because I've been here for 20 years now too, I hear a particular bird come in and it lands in the mulberry just as the mulberry tree is starting to grow its leaves and get its new fruit on it. And I know, great, it's kind of the rains are about to come, which means I can start to plant this, or all the wild mustards come up. And I think, great, that means that it's time to start doing the brassicas if I want to put any other brassicas in. Just so reading the landscape rather than the chart, because the charts just kind of like change all the time. Whereas when you're reading the landscape and reading the garden and reading the plants and the birds and being part of that, that system, then just try and be present and notice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's,
I love that.
Yeah. And I think
that's like something that I thought was really, because I wasn't, like I said, wasn't like particularly interested in foraging before getting interested in permaculture. And then as I sort of understood what you just described, that relationship between the more wild landscape and a cultivated space, that's kind of, that's really interesting.
Yeah. And I think, gosh, like I feel this after being in this place for 20 years, 25 years maybe. Imagine, what it feels like to be in this place for 100,000 years. And it really shifts my perspective on so many things, just having this deep relationship to country, and really working a lot too with a local Indigenous group to try and explore relationships.
I can say this, which is that as someone who's mixed heritage, like I'm half Nigerian and half English, and grew up in South Africa and then in England, and was like always moving around, even when we were in South Africa and when we were in England. And then when I was like an adult, like a young adult, I was living on a canal boat and we were moving around on the boat as well. So like as somebody who I feel like in my body and in my mind, I've been very transient and not necessarily like connected to place. Like growing a garden has been like when you say you've been in that space for 20 years and all the things that and understand, that it's like I crave that so much, and I can't wait to like one day have that experience. And then to me it's like the greatest gift that I could offer my kids one day is to be able to hand some of that down so they can layer on top of that. And it's such an exciting thought, that it's partly exciting and partly sad that that knowledge has been lost, but B, that I guess I'm starting to try and find some of it, like a slither of it. Probably won't find much in one lifetime, but
But
got to start.
I think, yeah, exactly. We've got to start somewhere and inspire that curiosity and the love and the connection and the belonging and whatever we gather and whatever stories and knowledge and ways of relating to plants, and just keep on passing that and keep talking to each other. And I think that's, and creating places that inspire. I think that's it. When people can come in and they walk through it, whether it be digitally or if they get a chance to come and wander through a garden, that is incredibly powerful as well, I think. Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of something that, where are you heading to next? Have you got any new big projects coming up that you're thinking of, or are you just grounding and re-earthing?
The main things that I'm focusing on are the community growing project, because for me that's a really exciting real life project. I think that, digital sharing, etc., is like incredible, but the stuff that really feeds me is like real life, obviously. And then that's kind of like we're just wanting to kind of keep developing that, because we're only in our second year and we'd really love to like secure more funding and kind of turn it into some sort of example that can be replicated within the kind of local context of other communities, and become a bit of an example potentially. So that's the kind of like where a lot of my energy is going, which is really, really nice.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's wonderful. And I wonder what do you when you're out talking with groups, what do you say to them to encourage them to dive deeper? What's your call to action?
Like, don't be afraid to experiment and get it wrong, because you will. And so many times people are like, oh, but what if? And it's like, things will go wrong and things will break and they will die, and that's life, and that's part of the whole learning experience. Yeah, I think don't be afraid to experiment. Just like do.
Yeah, that's such great advice. And I think that's the thing too. We get so caught up is like, oh, it's got to be, we open the horticulture books and think it's got to have this much NPK and this much and these many spacings, and then just to stand back and to watch how nature's gardening and to garden with nature, I think it kind of simplifies it somewhat, doesn't it? And you do learn the lessons. She'll tell you pretty quickly whether it's working or not.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that like sort of desire for an end goal of perfection is exactly part of what the garden kind of dispels. It's like there is no end goal. Like it just keeps going.
Yeah.
And I think that so I think it's very common nowadays for us to feel very overwhelmed. I know I did. And I often still do, and kind of like frozen in the gravity of like some of the issues we're facing today, particularly climate change. And, the main thing is action. Like if we don't do things, nothing will change. And there is so much, radical change to be found in the growing space. So I think, the main thing is just like, don't be scared of getting it wrong. The only way you can get it wrong is if you don't do anything at all. Like, anything is better than nothing.
Yeah, great. And where can people find things about the work that you're doing, the resources that you have? And I know that you also have a course that you have. Do you want to just tell us a bit about that and where people can find you?
Yeah, so I'm on social media on Instagram, poppy.okotcha. That's POPPY and then OKOTCHA. I've got a website as well, which is also my name, and an online course with a platform called Create Academy. So you can find Create Academy me through any search engine and find my course through them. And I sort of speak on various podcasts and write for various publications, which you can find on my website when they come out. And next summer and spring we'll be back doing talks and stuff around the place, so they will be listed up on my website as well when they happen, but that will be in England, so I don't know. I don't know how useful that is to most of your listeners.
People tune in from all over the world with this, so
amazing.
Yeah, that's that'd be great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute delight having a chance to chat with you and to hear about all the wonderful perspective and your beautiful garden and approach. I think that sense of we are nature, that message alone is enormous. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was also a pleasure hearing about your relationship with your space as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Poppy. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Sense Making in a Changing World. Remember, check out the show notes below to find links to Poppy's work, and also check out the notes too to find details about our permaculture courses, our YouTube, our blog, and free masterclasses and film clubs all about permaculture. And make sure that you get signed up too to hear news and updates. And come and join us at the Permaculture Education Institute to learn practical skills for designing and teaching permaculture and making a good livelihood while living a permaculture-inspired, one planet way of life. Take care. I'll see you all soon.